We have some breaking news that we are very sorry to report, and that is that Dolly Parton has died.
Dolly Parton's life was always filled with bright lights, music, fame, and millions of devoted fans. But now, a shocking turn has taken her story in a completely different direction. As soon as the news spread, questions began to surface. What really happened? What did the public know about her health? And what is actually true behind the rumors? In this video, we're going beyond the headlines to uncover the truth about Dolly's final chapter, her private lifestyle, and the fortune she built over decades. Stay until the end, because the final details may surprise you. Before Dolly Parton became a global superstar, she was simply a little girl growing up in the mountains of Tennessee. She came from a large, poor family, where money was often tight. But there was something her family did have in abundance: music. Dolly started singing and performing when she was very young. Those early years shaped the person the world would later know. She did not come from a famous family. She did not have a wealthy background. And she did not have a powerful Hollywood connection waiting to open doors for her. She had her voice. She had her songwriting. And she had an unusual determination to build something bigger than the life she had been born into. That determination would eventually take her from rural Tennessee to some of the biggest stages in the world. Dolly Parton became one of the most successful country artists ever, with a career that lasted more than 6 decades. She wrote songs that became classics, including Jolene and I Will Always Love You. She also became a successful actress, businesswoman, and philanthropist. But there was something different about Dolly. Fame never completely changed the way she talked about where she came from. She continued to speak proudly about her Appalachian roots. Instead of hiding her past, she turned it into part of her identity. And that decision became one of the biggest reasons people connected with her. Dolly did not simply become famous. She created a character the world could recognize instantly. The big hair. The colorful clothes. The humor. The bright smile. The powerful voice. But behind that famous image was a woman who understood business better than many people realized. As her music career grew, Dolly began moving into movies, television, business, and other projects. One of the biggest examples was Dollywood. The theme park, which opened in 1986, became deeply connected to her Tennessee roots and helped transform the local tourism industry. This was no longer just a singer making money from records. Dolly was building an entire business world around her name. And that would become extremely important later. Because when people talk about Dolly Parton's wealth, they often focus only on her music. But her fortune was built through much more than singing. She understood something many entertainers learn too late. Fame can disappear, but a strong business can continue working long after the spotlight moves somewhere else. Dolly invested in ideas connected to her name, her hometown, entertainment, and her audience. At the same time, she built a reputation for giving money away. Her imagination library became one of her most important projects, sending free books to children around the world. According to the Associated Press, the program has distributed more than 330 million books. That tells you something important about Dolly. Her story was never only about becoming rich. It was about turning success into something that could continue helping other people. But there is another side to her story. Dolly became famous for being open, funny, and warm with the public. Yet she also protected large parts of her private life. Fans saw the celebrity. They saw the performances. They saw the interviews. But they did not always see what was happening away from the cameras. That became especially important during the later years of her life. Even while she continued working and creating new projects, questions about her health began appearing. And when rumors started spreading online, separating fact from speculation became harder. Then came the news that shocked millions of people. Dolly Parton died at the age of 80 in Tennessee on August 25, 2026. Her death was reported as following a short battle with cancer. Suddenly, every old rumor about her health was being looked at again. People wanted to know. How long had she actually been sick? What did the public know? What was confirmed, and what was simply internet speculation? And perhaps the biggest question of all: how did someone who seemed so full of energy reach the final chapter of her life without the world knowing the complete story? Those questions matter because Dolly had spent decades creating an image of strength. She was the woman who kept working. The woman who kept writing. The woman who kept helping others. The woman who seemed almost impossible to slow down. Even near the end of her life, she remained connected to music and creative projects. That is why her death felt so shocking to so many people. But there is something else we need to understand. The story of Dolly Parton cannot be measured only by the day she died. Her real story is about what happened before that day. It is about how a poor girl from Tennessee became one of the most recognizable entertainers on earth. It is about how she turned songs into a fortune. It is about how she built businesses without losing the image of the country girl people loved. And it is about the private life that existed behind the famous smile. Because the woman people thought they knew from television was only part of the story. And once you look closer, some of the biggest surprises are not about her fame at all. They are about how carefully she built her life, how she protected the people closest to her, and how she turned her success into a legacy that may last far beyond her music. But before we can understand the rumors surrounding her final years, we need to look at the private Dolly, the woman behind the costumes, the jokes, the fame, and the enormous public image. For most of the world, Dolly Parton was easy to recognize. The big hair, the bright clothes, the famous smile, the jokes, the music, the confidence. But behind that larger-than-life image was a woman who was much more private than many people realized. Dolly understood something very early in her career. Being famous meant that people would always want to know more about her. They wanted to know where she lived. They wanted to know about her marriage. They wanted to know what she did when the cameras were gone. But Dolly did not give the public everything. She gave them enough to feel connected to her. Then she kept some important parts of her life for herself. That balance became one of the most interesting parts of her story. For nearly 60 years, Dolly was married to Carl Dean. They married in 1966, long before Dolly became one of the biggest names in entertainment. And unlike many celebrity relationships, Carl stayed mostly away from the spotlight. He did not spend his life chasing cameras. He rarely appeared beside Dolly at major public events. And Dolly often joked about how different the two of them were. She was constantly surrounded by music, fans, business meetings, and public attention. Carl preferred a much quieter life. That difference did not seem to stop their relationship from lasting for decades. In fact, their private marriage became part of Dolly's public image. Fans were fascinated by the fact that one of the most famous women in the world had managed to keep such an important relationship mostly out of Hollywood's noise. Then, in March 2025, Carl Dean died. He had been Dolly's husband for almost 6 decades. His death changed her life in a way that fans could not fully see. Dolly continued working. She continued talking about music. She continued planning projects. But later, she admitted that she had been dealing with her own health issues and had not paid enough attention to them while caring for Carl. That detail would become very important later. In an interview published shortly before her death, Dolly said she was still dealing with health problems but remained focused on work and the things she wanted to achieve. That statement gives us an important look at Dolly's personality. Even when things were difficult, she wanted to keep moving. That had been her pattern for most of her life. Work. Create. Perform. Help people. Keep going. But there was another side to her private life. Dolly did not have biological children with Carl. Instead, she remained closely connected to her large family. She grew up as one of 12 children, and her family remained an important part of her life. Her childhood experiences also helped shape the way she thought about money. She knew what it felt like to have very little. She knew what it meant to grow up in a home where even basic comforts were not guaranteed. That may be one reason she became so passionate about helping children. Her imagination library became one of her most famous projects. The program provides free books to children, and it eventually expanded far beyond Tennessee. Hundreds of millions of books have been distributed through the program. So while Dolly built a huge personal fortune, she also created systems that allowed her success to reach people she might never meet. That contrast is important. Dolly was surrounded by wealth. But she never stopped talking about the poor girl she once was. She also never seemed interested in completely changing the image people had of her. Instead, she turned it into a strength. Some people looked at her glamorous style and assumed she was simply playing a character. But Dolly understood exactly what she was doing. The hair was part of the brand. The clothes were part of the brand. The humor was part of the brand. Even her self-deprecating jokes became part of her connection with audiences. But behind that public character was a highly careful businesswoman. She knew the value of her name. She knew the value of her songs. She knew the value of her image. And she knew how important it was to control what the public saw. That control became even more important as she grew older. Because fame changes when a celebrity reaches their later years. Every cancelled appearance creates questions. Every missed event creates rumors. Every health update can become a headline. And in the age of social media, those rumors can spread faster than the truth. That is exactly what happened around Dolly. When she began stepping back from some public appearances and projects, fans noticed. Some people became worried. Others began guessing. And some online stories went much further than the information Dolly herself had shared. This is where we need to separate concern from fact. Dolly had publicly acknowledged health problems. She had also spoken about treatments and recovery. But that did not mean every rumor about her condition was true. In fact, shortly before her death, she was still telling fans that she was healing and that she wanted to keep working. That made the later news even more difficult for people to process. The public had seen Dolly as someone who was still fighting, still creating, still planning, still dreaming. And then, suddenly, there was no more future project to wait for. There was only the final chapter. Her representatives later confirmed that she had died after a brief battle with cancer. The specific type of cancer was not publicly disclosed in the initial confirmation. That distinction matters. For years, people had been discussing rumors about Dolly's health. But the confirmed information came much later. And once that information became public, many people began looking back at the clues they had missed. The cancelled plans. The health updates. The treatments. The comments about needing time to recover. The changes in her public schedule. Suddenly, old moments seemed different. But we should be careful. Looking backward can create the illusion that every old event was a warning sign. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was not. And sometimes the public simply did not have enough information to know. That is the difficult part of celebrity stories. Fans feel like they know the person. They watch interviews. They listen to songs. They see photographs. They follow social media. But there is always a private world behind the public one. Dolly protected that private world for decades. And perhaps that is why her final health story created so many questions. People wanted to know more. They wanted a complete timeline. They wanted to know when she first became seriously ill. They wanted to know what happened in the final days. But some of those answers may remain private. And that is something Dolly herself had always understood. She could give the world her music. She could give the world her stories. She could give the world her humor. But she did not have to give the world every part of herself. That privacy was not a weakness. It was part of how she lived. And now, after her death, that private side of Dolly may be one of the things fans respect most. Because behind the famous image was not just a superstar. There was a woman who experienced love, loss, pressure, health problems, and aging just like everyone else. The difference was that millions of people were watching. And as the world began asking what really happened to Dolly Parton, one question became impossible to ignore. How much did the public actually know about her health before the final news arrived? That is where the rumors, the missed appearances, and Dolly's own final health updates become important. And the closer we look, the more complicated the story becomes. The biggest question surrounding Dolly Parton's final days is not simply what happened. It is how much the public actually knew before the news of her death arrived. For years, Dolly had been known as someone who kept moving. She worked. She performed. She wrote songs. She created business projects. And even when life became difficult, she often tried to look forward instead of backward. That made the changes in her health especially difficult for fans to understand. Before her death, Dolly had publicly acknowledged that she was dealing with health problems. But she did not give the public every detail. And that left space for rumors to grow. In today's world, that can happen very quickly. A celebrity misses an event. Someone notices a change in appearance. A short statement appears online. Then people begin asking questions. One person guesses. Another person repeats the guess. Soon, the guess becomes a rumor. And eventually, the rumor can start looking like a fact. That is exactly why Dolly's story needs to be handled carefully. Because there were real health concerns. But there were also many things the public simply did not know. Shortly before her death, Dolly spoke publicly about dealing with health issues and said she still had many things she wanted to accomplish. That made the later announcement even more shocking to fans. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Dolly Parton died on August 25, 2026, at the age of 80. Her publicist said she died peacefully in Nashville. Her representatives also described her final illness as a brief battle with cancer. That is the key confirmed information. But notice something important. The initial Reuters report said that the family statement itself did not disclose a specific cause of death, while her publicist separately described the illness as a brief battle with cancer. That distinction matters when talking about rumors. It means we should not take every claim circulating online and present it as part of Dolly's official medical story. The public does not have every medical detail. And Dolly had every right to keep those details private. Still, the announcement caused many fans to look back at her final public comments. They remembered that she had talked about health problems. They remembered changes in her schedule. They remembered moments when she seemed to be slowing down. And suddenly, those moments felt different. But there is a danger in looking backward. When something tragic happens, people naturally search for clues. They look at old interviews and photographs. They ask whether something was missed. They try to connect events that may not actually be connected. That can create a story that feels complete, even when the evidence is not complete. So what can we actually say? We can say that Dolly had publicly acknowledged health problems. We can say that she was still talking about future projects. We can say that she died at 80 in Nashville. And we can say that her representatives described her final illness as a brief battle with cancer. Beyond that, many details remain private. And that privacy is important. Because Dolly spent much of her life controlling her public image. She knew how to make millions of people feel close to her while still keeping parts of her personal life away from the cameras. That was one of her greatest strengths. But it also created a strange situation after her death. People wanted answers. They wanted a complete timeline. They wanted to know when the illness began. They wanted to know what treatment she received. They wanted to know what happened in her final days. But not every question has an answer that the public is entitled to. Sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is accept what has been confirmed and leave the private details with the family. That does not mean there is no story. There is. And it is a very important one. Because Dolly's health was only one part of what happened near the end of her life. There was also grief. Just months before Dolly's own death, she had already experienced a major personal loss. Her husband, Carl Dean, died in March 2025 after nearly 60 years of marriage. For Dolly, that loss was deeply personal. She had spent most of her adult life with him. And even though the public knew his name, Carl had remained mostly outside the celebrity world. Dolly later spoke about her grief and the way her faith helped her continue. That loss changed the final period of her life. But she kept working. She kept creating. She kept talking about the future. And perhaps that was simply Dolly being Dolly. She had spent her entire career moving forward. Even when she was tired. Even when she was grieving. Even when things were difficult. That determination was one of the qualities fans admired most. But it also meant that people may not have realized how much she was carrying privately. And that is where the difference between the public Dolly and the private Dolly becomes so important. The public saw a woman who seemed almost unstoppable. The private person may have been dealing with things that fans could not see. That does not mean every rumor was true. It simply means that celebrities are human beings. They can become sick. They can become tired. They can struggle privately. And they can choose not to tell the world everything. Dolly's final story reminds us of that. It also shows how quickly social media can turn uncertainty into certainty. When a famous person becomes seriously ill, people often want immediate answers. But real life does not always provide immediate answers. Sometimes families need time. Sometimes doctors do not release information. Sometimes the celebrity wants privacy. And sometimes the truth only becomes known after the person is gone. That is why the most responsible version of Dolly's story is not the most dramatic one. It is the one that separates what we know from what we do not know. And what we know is already powerful enough. A woman who spent more than 6 decades entertaining millions was still working and thinking about the future. Then, suddenly, that future ended. Dolly Parton's representatives confirmed that she had faced a brief battle with cancer. And the world was left to remember everything she had built. Her music. Her movies. Her businesses. Her family. Her generosity. Her humor. Her enormous influence. But there is another part of her story that many people misunderstand. When you hear the word net worth, it is easy to imagine a giant bank account sitting somewhere with Dolly's name on it. That is not how celebrity wealth works. Dolly's fortune was connected to years of songwriting, publishing, business ownership, entertainment projects, investments, and intellectual property. And some of those assets may continue creating value long after her death. So if you really want to understand how Dolly became so wealthy, you have to look beyond the music charts. You have to look at the business decisions she made while other entertainers were simply chasing the next hit. Because the next chapter reveals one of the most impressive parts of Dolly Parton's story. How a girl who grew up with very little built a business empire that became almost as important as her music. When people hear the name Dolly Parton, most people think about music. They think about Jolene. They think about 9 to 5. They think about I Will Always Love You. But music was only one part of Dolly's financial story. She understood something very important about fame. A hit song can make you famous. But owning valuable rights, businesses, and ideas can help create wealth for many years. Dolly learned this lesson early. Instead of giving away control of everything she created, she became deeply involved in the business side of her career. One of her smartest decisions involved her songwriting. Dolly wrote many of her own songs. That meant she could earn money not only when she performed them, but also when other artists recorded or used them. The clearest example is I Will Always Love You. Dolly wrote and recorded the song herself in 1974. Years later, Whitney Houston recorded her own version for the movie The Bodyguard. That version became a worldwide hit. And Dolly benefited from the success because she owned the underlying songwriting rights. That decision became one of the most valuable moments of her career. It also showed something important about Dolly. She was not simply thinking about the next paycheck. She was thinking about what her work could be worth years later. That same thinking appeared in other parts of her career. Dolly moved into movies. She became involved in television. She created businesses. She built entertainment projects. And eventually, her name became connected to a much bigger brand. One of the most important pieces was Dollywood. The theme park opened in 1986 in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. It was not just another business project. It was connected to Dolly's roots. The park helped turn the area into a major tourist destination and became an important part of her business empire. This is where Dolly's story becomes especially interesting. She could have simply used her fame to sell products. Instead, she built experiences around her identity: music, entertainment, family, Tennessee, and the simple values she had talked about for decades. That combination created something much bigger than a celebrity endorsement. It created a brand. And that brand became extremely valuable. But there is another important part of Dolly's wealth. Her name itself became an asset. People trusted the Dolly Parton brand. They knew what they were going to get: a family-friendly image, a strong work ethic, a sense of humor, music, kindness, and a connection to her roots. That trust can be worth a huge amount of money. Companies spend years trying to create that kind of reputation. Dolly had built it naturally over decades. She also made smart moves with entertainment. Her songs continued to be recorded by other artists. Her stories continued to be adapted. Her music continued to appear in movies and television. Her older work did not simply disappear when new music came along. It continued creating value. That is one reason celebrity wealth can be difficult to understand. A person may stop working on a song decades ago, but that song can still generate income. A movie can keep earning money. A business can keep growing. A theme park can continue attracting visitors. A brand can continue selling products. And intellectual property can continue producing value long after it was first created. Dolly understood that better than most entertainers. But there is something else that made her business story unusual. She did not appear obsessed with looking rich. Dolly was glamorous. She loved fashion. She loved big hair. She loved beautiful clothes. But she also continued to talk about her humble beginnings. She never tried to pretend she came from wealth. Instead, she made her childhood part of her story. That helped fans connect with her. They could look at the superstar and still remember the little girl from Tennessee. And that connection had real value. People did not simply buy Dolly's music. They bought into a story. A story about hard work. A story about dreams. A story about staying true to yourself. And a story about helping others once you become successful. That last part is important. Because Dolly did not keep all of her success focused on herself. Her imagination library became one of her biggest charitable projects. The program gives free books to children from birth until age 5. It started in Tennessee but eventually expanded across the United States and into other countries. The program has distributed hundreds of millions of books. That is an enormous number. And it shows why Dolly's legacy cannot be measured only in dollars. She built financial success, but she also built something that reached children who might never have been able to afford those books themselves. This is part of why the public reaction to her death has been so emotional. People are not only remembering a singer. They are remembering someone whose work touched many different parts of their lives. For some people, it was a song. For others, it was a movie. For children, it may have been a book. For families, it may have been a visit to Dollywood. For fans in Tennessee, it may have been the feeling that one of their own had become a global star without forgetting home. That kind of legacy is difficult to put into a number. And that brings us to Dolly's reported net worth. There have been many different estimates online. Some websites have placed her fortune in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But celebrity net worth figures should always be treated as estimates unless the person or their representatives publicly provide detailed financial records. There is no simple public number that tells us exactly how much Dolly owned at the time of her death. Her wealth was spread across different areas: music rights, publishing, businesses, entertainment, real estate, brand partnerships, and other assets. So saying she had exactly a certain amount of money would give a false sense of certainty. The more interesting story is how she built the wealth in the first place. She started with very little. Then she turned talent into songs. Songs into intellectual property. Fame into businesses. Businesses into long-term assets. And success into charitable work. That is a much bigger story than a single net worth number. But there is one question that naturally comes next. If Dolly became so successful, did she actually live like someone worth hundreds of millions? The answer is more complicated than you might expect. Her public image was full of glamour. But her personal lifestyle often appeared much simpler. She enjoyed the things she liked. She worked hard. She valued privacy. And she stayed closely connected to the place where she grew up. That contrast is one of the most fascinating parts of her life. The woman with the enormous career was also someone who never completely left her roots behind. And after her death, that may be one of the biggest reasons people continue to talk about her. Not just because she became rich. Not just because she became famous. But because she seemed to understand that success means more when it can be shared. Still, there is another side of Dolly's story that deserves attention. Behind the millions of records, businesses, awards, and public appearances was a woman who had experienced deep personal loss. And in the final years of her life, that private side became more important than ever. Dolly Parton had something most celebrities could only dream about. She had fame. She had money. She had worldwide recognition. And she had the power to walk into almost any room and instantly become the center of attention. But despite all of that, Dolly often presented herself as someone who never forgot where she came from. That may be one of the biggest reasons people trusted her. She could have built her entire image around wealth. Instead, she often talked about family, hard work, faith, music, and her Tennessee roots. Dolly grew up in a large family. She was one of 12 children, and life at home was not easy. Her family did not have much money. But music was always around her. Those early experiences stayed with her. Even after she became one of the most famous women in the world, she continued to speak about the lessons she learned as a child. One of those lessons was the importance of family. Dolly's family became a major part of her life and her inspiration. Some of her songs were influenced by people and experiences from her childhood. Her famous song, Coat of Many Colors, was inspired by a coat her mother made for her. The song became much more than a story about clothing. It became a story about poverty, love, pride, and the power of a mother's love. That tells us something about Dolly. She had the ability to take a difficult memory and turn it into something beautiful. That same attitude appeared throughout her life. She did not hide the fact that she had grown up poor. She used it. She turned it into music. She turned it into stories. And eventually, she turned those experiences into part of the brand that made her famous. But there was another person who played an enormous role in her private life. Her husband, Carl Dean. Dolly and Carl married in 1966. Their marriage lasted nearly 6 decades. That is remarkable by any standard. But what made their relationship even more unusual was how private Carl remained. Dolly was everywhere. Television. Concerts. Movies. Award shows. Interviews. Business events. Carl was almost the opposite. He preferred to stay away from the spotlight. That difference became part of their story. Dolly once described their personalities as very different. She loved being around people. Carl preferred a quieter life. Yet they stayed together for decades. That private relationship was something Dolly protected. She could talk about Carl in interviews. She could joke about marriage. But she did not turn their relationship into a constant celebrity show. That privacy became even more important after Carl died in March 2025. For Dolly, it was a major personal loss. She had spent most of her adult life with him. And while millions of people knew Dolly Parton, very few people truly knew what her private life with Carl looked like. That was intentional. Dolly understood that not everything needed to become entertainment. That is an important lesson in a world where celebrities are expected to share almost everything. Dolly did not. She created a boundary. And she kept it. Even after Carl's death, she continued working. She talked about grief. She talked about missing him. But she also talked about moving forward. That ability to keep going was one of the strongest themes of her life. But there was another part of Dolly's private life that fans often found interesting. She did not have children of her own. Instead, she became deeply involved in helping children through her charitable work. Her imagination library became one of the clearest examples. The program sends free books to young children. It began as a small effort inspired by Dolly's father, who could not read or write. Over time, it grew into an international program. Hundreds of millions of books have been distributed. That is an incredible legacy. And it connects directly to Dolly's childhood. She knew what it meant to grow up without many resources. She knew that opportunities could be limited. And she wanted children to have something that could open a door for them. A book. A story. An idea. A chance to imagine a different future. That is why Dolly's lifestyle cannot be judged only by expensive clothes or celebrity wealth. Her real priorities appeared in the things she continued supporting. Family. Children. Music. Her hometown. Education. and helping people who needed a little extra support. Of course, Dolly enjoyed luxury too. She became famous for glamorous clothes, jewelry, and her unforgettable style. But the glamour was part of her public personality. She often joked about it. She understood that people expected Dolly Parton to look like Dolly Parton. The hair, the makeup, the clothes, the heels, the sparkle. But underneath that image was a person who seemed very aware of the difference between looking rich and actually building something valuable. That is another reason her business success is so interesting. She did not simply spend the money she earned. She used her fame to build long-term projects. And she continued working even when she no longer needed to prove herself. That raises an important question. Why keep working after achieving so much? Dolly had already sold millions of records. She had already become a movie star. She had already built Dollywood. She had already made an enormous amount of money. She could have walked away. But she did not. She continued writing. She continued planning. She continued creating. Even in her later years, she talked about future projects. That makes her final chapter feel especially sad. Because Dolly still had plans. She still had things she wanted to accomplish. And shortly before her death, she was still talking about wanting to achieve more. That is why the final news shocked people. Fans were not expecting a goodbye. They were expecting another project. Another song. Another interview. Another Dolly Parton story. Instead, they received news that the woman who had spent her entire life moving forward had reached the end of her journey. And suddenly, every part of her lifestyle looked different. Her privacy. Her marriage. Her family. Her health. Her work. Her plans. Her wealth. Her generosity. People began looking at the entire story again. And this is where the difference between Dolly's public image and private reality becomes clear. The public Dolly was almost larger than life. She was funny. She was colorful. She was confident. She seemed unstoppable. But the private Dolly was also a wife who experienced deep loss. A daughter who never forgot her parents. A sister from a large family. A woman who dealt with health problems. And a person who knew that life could change very quickly. That human side may be the most important part of her story. Because fame can make a person seem different from everyone else. But Dolly's life reminds us that even the biggest stars experience many of the same emotions as ordinary people. Love, grief, fear, hope, loss, and the desire to keep going. That is why her death has created such a powerful reaction. People are not simply mourning a singer. They are mourning a piece of their own memories. For some, Dolly's songs were part of childhood. For others, her movies were part of family life. For others, she represented the idea that someone could come from very little and still build an extraordinary future. And for millions of children, her name may be connected to the simple joy of receiving a book in the mail. That is a powerful legacy. But there is still one final part of this story. After all the rumors, all the questions, all the headlines, and all the numbers, what should we actually remember about Dolly Parton's final chapter? What is confirmed? What remains private? And when we remove the rumors and the celebrity headlines, what does Dolly Parton's life really leave behind? The answer may be much bigger than her cause of death or her net worth. Because Dolly did not simply build a fortune. She built a legacy. And that legacy may continue long after the headlines about her final days disappear. For years, Dolly Parton gave the world something very unusual. She gave people the feeling that they knew her. They knew her voice. They knew her songs. They knew her laugh. They knew her famous style. They knew the stories about growing up in Tennessee. But when it came to her private life, there were always limits. And those limits became even more important during her final years. After the death of her husband, Carl Dean, in March 2025, Dolly continued working while also dealing with grief and health problems. She did not suddenly disappear from the world. She still had plans. She still talked about projects. She still wanted to create. That is why the news of her death was so difficult for many fans to understand. On August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton died at the age of 80 in Tennessee. Her representatives confirmed that she had been dealing with cancer. Her publicist said she died peacefully. But the full medical details of her final illness were not made public. That is important because the internet had already created many stories about Dolly's health. Some were based on real comments. Others were based on guesses. And some went much further than the facts. When a famous person dies, this happens all the time. People start searching for answers. Old photographs are shared. Old interviews are examined. Old rumors suddenly become popular again. People ask, was she sick for years? Did she know how serious it was? Why didn't she tell everyone? Were there signs that fans missed? These are understandable questions. But not every question has a public answer. Dolly had a right to privacy. And her family had a right to privacy too. What we do know is that Dolly had publicly acknowledged health problems before her death. She had also spoken about continuing to work and wanting to accomplish more. That tells us something about her final mindset. She was still looking ahead. She was still thinking about the future. She was not simply sitting back and looking at what she had already achieved. She still had dreams. That may be one of the most powerful details in her final story. Dolly Parton spent her entire life looking forward. As a young girl, she looked beyond poverty. As a new singer, she looked beyond small stages. As a songwriter, she looked beyond one hit. As a businesswoman, she looked beyond music. And as an older woman, she still looked toward the future. That attitude helped define her. But it also makes her death feel especially sudden. She had spent decades convincing people that there was always another song, another show, another idea, another dream. And then there wasn't. Her death also changed the way people looked at her financial success. For years, the internet had been filled with estimates of Dolly's net worth. Some estimates placed her fortune at several $100 million. But there is a major difference between an online estimate and a verified financial statement. Dolly's exact net worth was not something the public could simply calculate from one bank account. Her wealth came from many different sources. Her songwriting, music publishing, recordings, movies, television, business investments, Dollywood, licensing, and other projects connected to her name. Some of these assets could continue producing money even after her death. That is one of the biggest lessons from Dolly's career. She did not only create songs. She created intellectual property. She built businesses. She created a brand. And she made decisions that allowed her work to keep earning value over time. But if we focus only on the money, we miss the bigger story. Dolly's greatest achievement may not be the fortune she built. It may be what she did with the opportunities that fortune gave her. Her imagination library is one example. The program has sent hundreds of millions of books to children. It started with a simple idea. Give children books. Give them something to read. Give them a chance to imagine. That idea became much bigger than anyone could have expected. And it was deeply connected to Dolly's own childhood. She knew what it was like to grow up without much money. She knew how powerful a dream could be. So she tried to give that feeling to children around the world. That is why her legacy cannot be measured in dollars. Money can tell us how successful someone became. It cannot tell us how many people remembered them. It cannot tell us how many lives they touched. And it cannot measure the emotional connection created by a song. Dolly created thousands of those connections. Her music became part of people's lives. Her movies became family memories. Her books reached children. Dollywood became a destination for generations of families. And her personality became almost impossible to separate from the idea of American country music. That is an enormous legacy. But there is one more thing worth remembering. Dolly Parton never seemed interested in being seen as perfect. She joked about her appearance. She laughed at herself. She talked openly about her humble beginnings. She admitted that fame had its problems. And she never completely hid the fact that she was a real person behind the famous image. That may be why people felt so close to her. She did not try to appear like someone from another world. She appeared like someone who had simply worked extremely hard to build the life she wanted. And maybe that is the real answer to the question. What really happened to Dolly Parton? The simplest answer is that a woman who spent more than 6 decades creating, performing, building, and helping others reached the end of her life after a brief battle with cancer. But the bigger story is what happened before that final moment. A poor girl from Tennessee became a global superstar. A songwriter became a businesswoman. A celebrity became a philanthropist. A glamorous public figure protected a deeply private personal life. And a woman who could have spent her wealth only on herself used much of her influence to help other people. That is what remains. Not the rumors. Not the internet speculation. Not a single number claiming to show exactly how rich she was. The lasting story is the work. The music. The memories. The people she helped. And the millions of fans who will continue hearing her voice long after the headlines have disappeared. Dolly once built her career around the idea of dreaming bigger than your circumstances. She came from a place where money was limited. But imagination was not. And that may be the greatest lesson of her life. She did not allow her beginning to decide her ending. She created her own path. She made mistakes. She took risks. She worked harder. And eventually, she became someone whose name was known around the world. Now that her life has ended, people will continue asking questions. Some answers will be found in interviews. Some will be found in her songs. Some will remain private. And perhaps that is okay. Because a person's entire life cannot be explained by one final headline. Dolly Parton's story was much bigger than that. She was a singer, a songwriter, an actress, a businesswoman, a wife, a sister, a philanthropist, and, for millions of people, a symbol of hope. Her final chapter may have been painful, but it does not erase everything that came before it. If anything, it reminds us how valuable those years really were. She started with almost nothing. She built something enormous. And then she spent decades sharing pieces of it with the world. That is the part of Dolly Parton's story that the rumors can never take away.